On this episode of the NESN Patriots podcast, we recap what was another quiet trade deadline for the New England Patriots. Was this another missed opportunity for Bill Belichick? We look back at another loss to the Miami Dolphins, another rough game for Mac Jones, and we preview the upcoming game against the Washington Commanders. Hello and welcome to another edition of the NESN Patriots podcast. I'm Dakota Randall alongside Zach Cox. Trade deadline episode of the NESN Patriots podcast. Zach, can you smell that? Can you hear that? That is the smell and the sound of another wet fart Patriots trade deadline. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The Patriots don't do anything at the trade deadline today. They didn't sell. They didn't buy. A big fat goose egg from Bill Belichick and company. I guess, Zach, just initial reactions. I know you just wrote a column about whether or not it was a missed opportunity. What is your initial thought as we sit here with the Patriots once again standing pat at the deadline despite being 2-6?
Well, I initially thought that smell joke was going to be a Dakota is recording this podcast from a basement joke, but went in a different direction.
There are some weird smells down here. There's a dead June bug about a foot
away. I mean, it's the Patriots, so it's not really surprising. This is the third straight year that they've done nothing at the deadline. It's basically been about a half a decade since they made any move of note. This year, they seem to be in prime selling position, just obviously based on where they are in the standings and with some of the expiring contracts they had. In the end, it just doesn't sound like there were any enticing offers. According to reports, they did get calls on all three of their 2020 draft picks that were in the trade mix. Josh Uche, Kyle Duggar, Mike Onwenu. We don't know exactly what those offers were for. I thought that Josh Uche was going to get moved today. It seemed like things were moving in that direction just based on all the chatter over the previous week or so. But after you saw that Chase Young went for a third to San Francisco, Chase Young is a higher caliber player than Josh Uche. If you're looking at that, you're like, all right, maybe you're getting like a fifth for him. Maybe that's still worthwhile because he's probably not going to re-sign anyway this offseason. But I don't know. It doesn't sound like there were any moves on the table that the Patriots could have made that weren't just for kind of a late round throw-in type draft pick. And at that point, I can see why that they would just say, all right, whatever, we're just going to hold on to these guys anyway.
Yeah, listen, I think, my sort of thoughts specifically on Kyle Duggar are established at this point. I think they should have traded him before the season. I think they should have traded him today. I think he's overrated. I think even in that game the other day, I mean, I know he had some big impactful plays, but he also had some issues too, the same kind of issues you always see. I mean, maybe the Patriots have a better idea of what his value will be in free agency than I do. They probably do. And maybe he won't get the big top of the safety market contract that some think he might be able to get, and they'll get him on a discount or something like that. But I think they can figure things out at that spot. I don't think he's been so good that you need to hold on to him. I have to believe you could have gotten at least a third round pick. I would have done it. But for me also, I think Josh Uche, I can't understand not moving him at this point. I think there's no way he comes back. He does not fit in this defense. He's not a 3-down player. I think Anthony Jennings is a better player, at least for what the Patriots want to be on defense. Yeah, I mean, I know maybe you would have only been able to get a 5th-round pick, but I just think you had to make that deal. I don't understand it. But again, I mean, we're talking about a team who I think their last most, unless I'm forgetting one, their last most impactful trade deadline move was acquiring Mohamed Sanu for a 2nd-round pick, which was a horrendous deal, obviously.
Yeah, I think their most recent one was Isaiah Ford in 2020, who I don't know if he even ended up ever playing a snap for the Patriots. But yeah, I mean, the Uche aspect, I understand the Duggar one more because at least he is a very Patriot type player. Josh Uche just really isn't. I mean, not saying anything about him as a person or caliber player or anything like that. It's just, he's never going to be more than a situational pass rusher in this Patriots defense. A lot of teams that run different schemes, he can be an every down type player. So if you're able to get any value there at all, I think that's a move that was worth making. Again, maybe the value just wasn't there. And once you're starting to talk about 5th-round picks, 6th-round picks, then maybe it all just kind of comes out in the wash anyway. But it's really going to be interesting now to see if they make an extra effort to re-sign any of these impending rookie deal free agents, because I looked today and it's been a full decade since the Patriots drafted a player in the first 3 rounds and then signed him to a second contract. The last guy to do that was Daron Harmon, who was a 3rd-round pick back in 2013.
Of course, it
Since
was
then,
Ron Harmon.
yeah, from 2014 to 2019, so that 5-year stretch of players who were eligible for that, they drafted 19 players in the first 3 rounds, and 0 of them got contract extensions. There were some good players in there that ended up signing bigger deals elsewhere, or really one good player in there in Joe Thuney. But if you look back the previous 5 years before that, it was 18 picks in the first 3 rounds, and then 6 of them were signed to second contracts, not including Jamie Collins, who was traded and then came back. So I think that snapshot right there really encapsulates the Patriots drafting issues during that time. And then if they go through another year where they got 3 pretty good players, Owenu wouldn't really qualify in this discussion because he was a later round pick. But if you get some good players and then they also sign elsewhere, you're kind of like, what are we doing here? You eventually have to build up long-term talent through the draft. And the Patriots, outside of guys like Jawan Bentley and Dietrich Wise, some of the later round picks, they just haven't done that in a decade.
Yeah, no, it's very bad, and those numbers are interesting and pretty scary. I mean, yeah, I think with them not doing anything, and obviously they looked at it and said losing Josh Uche for a 5th-round pick isn't worth it. So what is more valuable to us? Losing Josh Uche for a 5th-round pick, or holding on to Josh Uche and preserving one or both or combination of the two of the culture, not wanting to send the message to the locker room that you're tanking, and there is value in that to some degree, or preserving some sort of chance at competing and still winning games this season. And so I look at this, and to me, the only thing that makes sense is that the Patriots ultimately decided that it's more valuable for them to hold on to some of these players with the hopes of turning things around and winning this season, with a soft part of the schedule coming up with the Commanders, the Colts, and the Giants. And so for me, that tells me that despite that sort of whole rant that Bill Belichick went on yesterday during his radio interview and video call about how he can't do both jobs full time, GM and head coach, to me this signals that he has to still be in full control as a general manager, because I have to believe that if this were up to Matt Groh and the other decision makers in the front office, or to Robert Kraft, in terms of what's best for the franchise, I have to believe that someone would have pulled rank and done something today to acquire assets for the future, if for no other reason than, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole too far, but for the compensation pick formula, which is a combination of free agents going out and free agents going in, with the Patriots having so much cap space this offseason, there's a real chance that they're not going to get any comp picks for these players that are leaving if they leave in free agency, like Uche, Duggar, and Wenu. So it would have behooved them to get something for them now, so they could have kept some draft picks and used all that free agency money. Instead, they might not be able to do any of that stuff. And, so to me, that means that at least the way I interpret it as, Belichick remains in full control, and this has sort of his fingerprints all over it.
I agree. I feel like it's been a little surprising to me that this has become as much of a question this week, because I don't think we've gotten any indications at all that Belichick hasn't been in full control. I can't really point to any moves that have been made or kind of strategic shift that say, oh, wow, maybe Bill Belichick is kind of taking a back seat. Obviously, there were some changes in the Patriots draft prep a couple of years ago where it did sound like he was inviting in some more voices, but he's still the guy in New England. He has the quote unquote final say on all personnel decisions. Bill O'Brien basically said as much when we were talking to him earlier today. I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone. Maybe you could make the argument that is an overdue change that they need to make, but I just don't know how you're going to be able to make that change unless Bill Belichick voluntarily says, hey, I don't think I've done a great job in this role as quote as de facto GM, I'm going to need somebody to kind of be over me and oversee that more often. I can't see him doing that. But that's also what kind of complicates this whole process, kind of what you just alluded to. The person making the roster decisions is also trying to keep his job as the head coach. And we don't know exactly how much jeopardy that job is in. I think only Robert Kraft probably knows that right now. But if it's a situation where Bill Belichick's saying, why am I going to trade away players and prepare for next year if there's a chance that I might not even be on the team next year? And
Right.
if us losing 7 more games down the stretch increases the chances that I'm not in my role next year, it's kind of a conflict of interests to an extent where you're are you really building for the future if the guy making those decisions doesn't know whether he's part of that future or not? So
Right.
again, nobody really knows the answers to those except for a few people inside that Patriots building, but it has to be discussed as a variable in this whole thing.
Right. And, and if you're Belichick and it sort of feels like an inevitability that you won't be here next season, what do you care about what kind of moves are made to set up the future of the franchise?
Add a couple more wins, get a little bit closer to Shula, and
exactly.
kind of take
Right.
your chances with the Giants next year or whatever. Like, yeah,
Right.
there's a definite kind of conflict of interest vibes going on with this whole thing.
Yeah, and I think to go back to your point about how we've seen nothing that would indicate that he's lost that GM power. I mean, I think I agree with you. I just think that maybe just given how poorly they've played this year, rightfully or not, it was a conversation of, maybe could Kraft step in and say, hey, we're not firing you midseason, but we can't allow you as GM to continue making the decisions that are going to determine the future of this franchise. But then, maybe that, we're talking about that, and maybe then it's not a coincidence that around the same time we start hearing about Belichick's contract, almost of a reminder of, hey, number one, it's not going to be that easy to fire me because you're going to have to pay for it, and two, this is just pure speculation. But by the way, there's language in there that gives me full control of all general manager responsibilities, and that stuff is no joke. I mean, if you have to honor that, you have to honor the terms of the contract, and if you don't, you can go to court over that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that's where we would go with this, but you have to honor that. If that's in the contract, then it's in the contract unless he gets fired. And so I look at it all and I'm like, yeah, I think it's in there. I think he's written down as the GM and he decided that this was the best place to go. And so it'll be talked about. I think we both disagree with it. Real quick, one player who we both believe absolutely should have been moved. I think we've touched on it. It seems like yours is Uche. Do you have any other one that you think was a no-brainer that absolutely should have been dealt?
I think it's Uche. The other veteran type players, we haven't really heard much about whether there were offers for any of those players or interest in any of those players. I know there's some conflicting reports on whether the Patriots got calls on Ezekiel Elliott. A couple outlets reported that they did. I believe it was Albert Breer reported that they didn't. I think if somebody was going to give you a 5th round pick for Ezekiel Elliott, who you signed for a ham sandwich a couple months ago, sure, flip him, do that. And it would leave you in a tricky spot at running back, but I could see that as a kind of easy asset upgrade there. But again, we don't know whether anything like that was even on the table. So it's kind of tough to say, man, they should have traded Mike Gesicki for a 4th round pick when nobody knows whether any team would even be willing to give that up.
Yeah, that was the one I was going to mention, is Ezekiel Elliott, where if you could have signed him off the street for basically nothing midway through August and then flipped him for really anything, I would have done it, especially if it was anything higher than a 7th round pick. But if it really was like just a 7th round pick on the table, then you do get into, we might as well hold on to him. If for no other reason, then we don't want to be in the situation we were in August where we have no depth behind Ramondre Stevenson and we don't want to run him into the ground. But yeah, I think he would have been one that would have made sense. I also wonder, one final point I'll make about all this is it feels like this is what they always were going to do, especially after they lost. But I do wonder if some of the injuries have, played a role too, where, maybe they would have traded someone like Kendrick Bourne, or maybe they would have traded, if they even had any value, someone like Juju or Devontae Parker or whomever. But, they're so shorthanded at receiver now that, like, what are you going to subtract more bodies? You're without Kendrick Bourne for the season. You could be without Devontae Parker for a little bit here. That was a pretty bad looking concussion. Are you going to pull even more guys from the equation? You're going to pull Tyquan Thornton out too, and then at edge rusher, you're hurt. Matthew Judon's hurt. You have all kinds of other issues going on with defense in terms of injuries. You're going to subtract Josh Uche too and make yourself even more shorthanded. Like at some level, someone has to play. You can't just like promote a bunch of practice squad guys because that is true tanking. And whether or not we think that's the right course of action, I don't see any way that Belichick would ever go all in on that kind of tanking.
Yeah, the Juju point is a good one. I'm curious whether if Bourne had not been injured, if Parker was healthy at the moment, even though Parker hasn't been playing especially well this season, if the Patriots would have done a hey, take Juju for a 6th, 7th round pick swap and we'll pay the rest of his salary for this season. One of those kind of things, similar to a JC Jackson.
Which I would have.
Yeah,
I
was advocating for that going into the trade deadline. I was saying, hey, if they can find anybody that'll even take Devontae Parker or Juju Smith-Schuster and give them anything really of value for Tyquan Thornton, who doesn't really seem like he has a role on this team at the moment, I would say take that. But the point about the injuries is valid because at some point you're not just going to sign a guy off the street and be like, all right, cool, go play 60 snaps in this game.
This isn't Madden.
Especially when you still have half of the season to go. You got to maintain some of that locker room structure. So yeah, in the end, it's not super surprising. But I am curious whether that's something they would have pursued if the circumstances were a little bit different.
Yeah. Again, I can totally hear Belichick in the bad Julian Edelman impression voice being like, we're only 2 games out of a wild card spot. We got Washington who just traded, Montez Sweat and Chase Young. Like I can hear him rationalizing it, and I don't necessarily disagree. But my response would be, to what end? Are we going to make the playoffs? Are we going to compete? Do we have a real shot? Of course not. I say that, maybe I'll eat my words, but I feel like that has to be his rationalization.
Yeah. Also, I like the impression of the impression. It's a nice little scale there.
Impressionception. All right, let's move on from the trade deadline because there literally is nothing to talk about. So it's tough to stay on it for too long. So we'll go to back to the Dolphins game real quick. Patriots lose 31-17 in Miami. Tua Tagovailoa now 6-0. Really, in many ways, a quintessential post-Tom Brady performance for the Patriots. A very on-brand Mac Jones game. If you looked at it from certain angles, you can be like, oh, they scored first, and Mac Jones made some plays. They scored at the end to pull within 7. There were some bad calls that went their way. They were so injured. If they had a full defense, maybe they get one of those stops at the end of the game. Maybe if Christian Gonzalez is in, they don't give up that big touchdown to Tyreek Hill, and all of a sudden you're holding the lead for longer. All these arguments you could say to make, well, maybe they were in the same realm when ultimately they weren't. The Patriots aren't nearly as good as the Dolphins. They aren't as talented. They aren't as well coached. And at the end of the day, Mac Jones, for as many excuses that we make for him, and I make a lot of them, and I stand by a lot of them, he made the critical mistake at the worst possible time. He played frantic and uneasy. And I think, a lot of times, his sort of style of play, I think, does set the tone for the offense where they play without confidence and they play sort of frantically. And I think that was the case again in this game where at the end of the day, the Patriots just aren't as good as the Dolphins, and they really weren't that close in that game. And it just is what it is. That's just the reality of the situation. So I think we'll do a quick 2 up, 2 down on both sides. Zach, why don't you give me your 2 up first?
2 up, Ramondre Stevenson. The stats weren't anything special for him in this game, but I think you saw a lot more of the vintage Ramondre Stevenson running style. There were 2, I think it was the drive that ended with the Mac Jones interception. You saw 2 just kind of run into a pile and somehow end up with 14 yards type plays from Stevenson, which we haven't seen a lot of this season. A lot of that was kind of predicated on some poor offensive line play, but he hasn't been turning as much into a big play as he was last year, for lack of a better term for that. But I thought you saw some movement from him in that direction, which was promising. And over on defense, I was going to mention Duggar, but we already touched on him a little bit earlier. He had the nice interception early, had a couple of tackles for loss as well. But I'm going to point out Keon White, Patriots rookie edge rusher. Missed the previous game with a concussion. The game he played in before that against the Saints a couple of weeks ago, I don't think he was especially impressive in that game. That was the first game after Matthew Judon's injury. I really think White got pushed around against New Orleans. But he was much more impressive in this game. He was in the backfield a lot. He drew at least one holding penalty, I think two. If you can get him playing the way that he did in this game and add that to what Christian Barmore has been able to do for the last couple of games, I think you've got something good to work with on that defensive line. We'll see whenever Josh Uche is able to get back in that mix. But yeah, I think that was one of the better games that we've seen from White so far this season. And that was definitely a good step in the right direction for him too.
Yeah, I agree. I think he was really good, especially on that tackle for loss. He just looked like a monster. For me, I'm going with Christian Barmore, number one. I just think, he got another sack. This is sort of 3 straight games now where he's been really impactful. I'm not going to say that he's emerged as a star in this league. I still think he has a little ways to go in that regard. But I do think, as he stays healthy and gets more time out there and plays a higher snap count in a bigger role, I mean, he is sort of establishing himself as a consistent, force and occasionally dominant player on the interior defensive line. I thought he was awesome in this game. I mean, yeah, he lost his head a little bit at the end with all the stuff after the Juju Smith-Schuster hit, but I think that's just kind of his personality. He's kind of an intense guy. I thought he was really good in this game. Number two, this is kind of not just for this game, but I think really throughout the season, I'm going to Mack Wilson. I'm not going to say he's been great this season. I still think he has a lot of issues at times. And in an ideal scenario, he wouldn't be playing for the Patriots. And he played a lot in this game too, especially once Juwan Bentley got hurt. But I think he was good in this game. I think he's been much more consistently reliable than he was, I think, at any point last year when after like week 8 or 9, he didn't see a single defensive snap. He was special teams only. I think a lot of us wrote him off, and I think for good reason. And again, I think he's really just been sort of a replacement level player for them this season. But I think he's been pretty good. I mean, if you just go by the PFF grades, which again, huge caveat always, he earned their 3rd highest defensive grade for the week. In terms of run defense, he was number 5. In terms of pass rush, he was number 3. And in terms of coverage, he was number 2. So he played, I think, a total of 45 snaps. That's a lot for him in a Patriots uniform. And I think he was good in this game. And I think overall, he's had a pretty decent and underrated season for the Patriots. Now, Zach, let's go for our 2 down. Who you got?
2 down, one, a player who I actually wrote pretty complimentary about last week, J.C. Jackson. Did not have a good game in this game, really had trouble covering Tyreek Hill early on. He allowed 2 touchdowns. He had a pass interference penalty in the end zone, kind of a ticky-tack call, but I think there was enough contact there that that's going to get called occasionally. He did end up having 2 pass breakups. I think he played better after halftime, but it was the level to which Tua Tagovailoa was comfortable targeting J.C. Jackson was kind of alarming for the Patriots defense. It was very clear that the Dolphins did not fear him whatsoever, which kind of makes sense because he had a pretty poor performance against them back in week 1 as well when he was with the Chargers. So I think this was a game where the Patriots missed Christian Gonzalez more so than in any of the other ones that they had played without him. It's hard to cover an offense like this when you don't have one kind of top tier level cornerback. And even though I think on the whole, Jackson has been good since he's come back here, he isn't really on that level. And I think they would have been in a better position if Gonzalez was healthy for this game, especially considering he would have had another 4 or 5 weeks of NFL experience. And then over on offense, Juju Smith-Schuster, I mean, he caught a touchdown in this game, his first in the Patriots uniform. So that was good, but he didn't see the field until after both Kendrick Bourne and Devontae Parker were injured. I believe his first snap came at the 13:47 mark of the 4th quarter. So it was clear that the Patriots did not want to play Juju at all in this game. And you doubt that he would have seen the field if both of those other guys hadn't gotten hurt. It's not really surprising because we were debating whether he was going to be a healthy scratch for this game. But just the fact that seeing how far he's fallen since signing that big deal in the offseason, it's really just been a disaster of a season for him. You imagine he'll probably have a bigger role moving forward, just out of necessity, since Bourne is out for the season, and Kendrick Bourne and Devontae Parker, we don't know how long he'll be out with that concussion. But he's really brought the Patriots next to nothing, and it's very clear that he's at the bottom of this receiver depth chart, which just kind of drives home just how flawed and regrettable of a signing that was this offseason.
Yeah. I mean, what else is there to say about it at this point? That's been a huge miss by the Patriots, and it only gets worse by the week. Basically, a healthy scratch. Yeah, not good for me. I'm going Mac Jones. Listen, I think, again, like I said earlier, this was a very Mac Jonesy game. I don't think he was terrible. I don't think he was good. He was kind of somewhere in the middle. And I do think he really still is a byproduct of his surroundings, where it makes him difficult to evaluate. But he just, that interception came at the worst possible time. It changed the complexion of the game. And it just can't happen. And it happened again. That's the kind of stuff where, what rope he does have left as the starter, it's only getting less and less with stuff like that.
He just keeps making the same mistakes. That's
the
biggest
throwing
issue.
Off the back foot. Like, to me, it's like so many of his interceptions, including against the Dolphins. It's a situation where he does not need to fall back on his back foot like that. And on this pass, yes, there were rushers coming at him, and he did get killed. But I think you can step up and drive the throw. I mean, he even admitted it after the game. And too often he falls back on his back foot, almost like this fadeaway jumper, and they always get picked.
It's back foot, it's late, and because of those, the ball never seems to have the I don't think the fact that the ball never has the necessary zip. I mean, part of that is because he doesn't have the rocket arm, but part of it is just because he's always throwing off these weird platforms and throwing at poor times. And I think on the whole, if you look at this whole season, you would say in most games, Mac has been somewhere between decent and actually good. I feel like the 2 blowout losses were really his only terrible games this season.
Yeah.
But almost every game has featured 1 or 2 plays like this, where it's just like that interception was a killer. You're driving down into the red zone. It's at least a 6-point swing, potentially a 10-point swing. You score there, you're probably tied at halftime. Instead, you're chasing the game for the whole second half, and you can't catch up.
Yeah, no, and you mentioned it. Yeah, the 2 blowout games are the 2 blowout games. But in all these other games that were close, the Eagles game, it's the pick six to Darius Slay, where you're like, what was going on there? You want to blame Kendrick Bourne, but really it's Mac Jones. The Dolphins game at home, the pick that was thrown to Devontae Parker, where you're like, well, maybe Devontae Parker could have been stronger on that ball, but again, it's another pick that ends a promising drive for the Patriots. That really bad pick in Las Vegas, that was a horrible throw, and Hunter Henry was wide open. Really no excuse for that one. And then this one, yeah, you look at it, and I've seen some people be like, Devontae Parker should have gone to the corner to take Jalen Ramsey with him, and all this other stuff. Like, a lot of things, the bones of that play were bad from the start. But again, it was a bad throw by Mac Jones. And it just keeps happening. So yeah, it was iffy in this game again. My other down, Cole Strange, gave up a couple pressures. We're doing this thing again where he's doing a rotation with Antonio Mafi. Maybe it's just, this happened when he was in Miami last year. Maybe he just doesn't play well in the heat, or he needs a break in the heat. I don't know. But I just, he's your first round pick from last year, and we're still in these situations where he's either getting benched or having to take rests, or it's something about lingering health. Like, I just don't understand. Like, at some point he needs to emerge as a set it and forget it left guard. And he's still not at that point. And I think that's a huge disappointment for him. And so the only other thing I wanted to touch on real quick, you mentioned with the Kendrick Bourne injury, Juju Smith-Schuster could have an increased role going forward, unfortunately, for the Patriots. Don't really want to get too much into it, but I do think it's worth pointing out Tyquan Thornton, healthy scratch in this game. Huge disappointment. Obviously, we've been over it as a second-round pick. I think by default, he's going to have to get more playing time going forward. I thought it was interesting that Bill O'Brien today sort of invoked the injury excuse for him, which I think is legit. I mean, he's lost so much practice time, and that's huge for a young receiver. So I would expect him to get more playing time going forward. But finally, Zach, as we finish here, Patriots against the Commanders this weekend. Obviously a must-win game for the Patriots. They all are from this point out. Commanders won't have Montez Sweat or Chase Young on defense. They traded both of those guys today. I guess one, what is your pick for this game? Do you like the Patriots? And two, are we crazy if we side with Bill Belichick in saying that if you win this game, you can kind of spark a run here and maybe get back into contention?
Well, one final point on that receiver question that you just mentioned. All of the Patriots' remaining receivers, so everybody except for Kendrick Bourne, if you put all of their stats together, they would be the 23rd most productive wide receiver in the NFL in terms of receiving yards so far this season. There are 22 individual players, 21 wideouts, and Travis Kelce, who have more receiving yards than everybody on the Patriots roster from a receiver's perspective outside of Kendrick Bourne. So, you're going to find out what happens when one of the NFL's worst passing attacks loses really their only consistent weapon. So maybe it'll be a Cinderella story and Juju Smith-Schuster will finally put some things together. Maybe Tyquan will end up breaking out, but things look pretty bleak for Mac Jones in that offense right now. All that being said, I don't know. I think the Patriots can easily win this game this weekend. As you mentioned, the Commanders just traded away two of their best defensive players. It seems like the locker room is not especially pumped about those moves based on just what we've seen on social media over the last hour or so. It seems like those were moves that were decreed from on high by the ownership group, not by the coaching staff or the personnel department. So it wouldn't be surprising if Washington shows up and is just kind of out of sorts and not really engaged in this game. And the Patriots, I mean, as you mentioned, they play a lot of mediocre to bad teams over the next month, 2 months. You got Washington this week, then the Colts in Germany, then the Giants, then the Chargers, who I still don't think are especially impressive. You got the Jets again this season. You've got Denver. I don't think the Patriots are going to go 3-14. I think they're going to win a fair number of these games down the stretch just because a lot of their opponents aren't especially good. But I do think that I'm officially ready to be done saying, hey, I don't know, maybe they can make a run if they put a couple things together. If they had beaten Miami, I would have been 100% in that boat, which is probably counterintuitive because it's only one game. But I just can't see any chance of them making a run to the playoffs right now. I mean, maybe, hopefully for our perspective, they'll at least make things interesting over these last couple of months. But yeah, I think the playoff ship has officially sailed.
Yeah, I would agree. Listen, I think they roll this weekend. I think they smoke the Commanders, and I think we come out of that game and say, and we inevitably sort of ask these questions to the players where, did you guys get a boost not selling at the deadline? And that sort of give your locker room a jolt. And then I think they followed up with a win against the Colts, and you're like, wow, maybe there really was something to it. And then they have some weird game against the Giants where they lose like 16-10, and we're like, oh yeah, they stink. But I do think, independent of all that, yeah, I think they got a shot to get close to 500 again by the end of the season. I think as of yesterday, they had like the 11th easiest remaining strength of schedule. So we'll see. I mean, the path is there. But I'm not picking them to finish above 500 or anything like that. I think that ship has sailed as well. But I do think they roll this weekend. The Commanders stink. Like you mentioned, they're going to be down after losing two of their best players. But good God, is this not going to be a fun game to watch? I don't think.
There's going to be a lot of those. This is going to be a gross game. The Giants game is going to be a gross game. The Giants had -9 passing yards the other day. Colts is probably going to be ugly. Set back American football several years over in Germany. So yeah, I'm expecting a lot of unattractive football over these final, 10 weeks of the season.
Oh God, it's not going to be easy. All right, but hey, as bad as the Patriots are and as boring as they are, and they are both of those things, for a variety of reasons, from Mac Jones to the status of Bill Belichick and some of these other variables, they do maintain some bizarre level of interest. And I do think they still will be interesting to watch going forward. And I do think there are some interesting things to sort of monitor in this game. So you can follow all of our coverage of Patriots and Commanders in the days leading up to kickoff and on game day and afterward at NESN.com. You can follow me on X at Dak Randall. You can follow Zach on X at Zach Cox NESN. And again, you can follow all of our Patriots coverage on NESN.com.